Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'd like to start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we're meeting today, the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations colleagues who are joining us here today. How is the sound level? Because I'm a bit of a soft talker. Can you hear me okay? Great. Awesome. So look, thank you very much to the Sheep Sustainability Framework Chair, the Board and the Steering Group for the invitation to join you at this launch event today. I'd also recognise there are a number of international delegations attending today from the US, Canada, New Zealand, and of course our young people and emerging leaders in our industry, so lovely to meet you all there. I am really pleased to join today because I really value the Sheep Sustainability Framework. It's a key communication and advocacy tool to support trade and market access for sheep meat and wool products. And that is exactly how I used it in the European Union to explain Australian sheep farmers' commitment to sustainable production, to animal health and welfare, and to the environment. It's an industry-led statement of values, themes, priorities, areas for action, monitoring and evaluation, and it's a credible and genuine commitment to industry-wide sustainability outcomes. The framework is not a nice to have. It is actually a must-have, and I think it's a real must-have for export-focused industries, and it's great to see and recognise the huge amount of work that's gone into contributing to actually implement this framework, and it's recorded in the 4th annual report. So why do I think the framework is a must-have? Globally, expectations around sustainability and emissions in capital markets, consumer markets, and the technical market access are all increasing. Australian agriculture has an internationally enviable environmental sustainability record. The sector's use of pesticides and fertilisers are below average in global comparisons. Our emissions intensities are amongst the lowest in the world, particularly for the cattle and grains, compared to major developed countries and major exporters. Where Australia's agricultural producers are uniquely positioned to take advantage of these opportunities. This is really important because in Department of Ag, we do see these increasing market requirements ahead. 86% of Australia's agriculture exports go to markets which have a net zero commitment. That trade is worth over $57 billion to us today. The majority of the largest 130 plus global agri-food companies have made net zero commitments, or they've set emissions reduction targets that will impact global agriculture and food supply chains, including Australian food and fibre exports. Global capital markets are increasingly taking climate and sustainability credentials into account in lending and in investment decisions. And we're seeing sustainable finance products and lending decisions are already being observed in the Australian agriculture sector. For wool growers in the room, you know the textile sector has been on a long-term sustainability trend. You've seen it with increasing market requirement in the value chain itself, your supply chain, and of course through regulation. And the EU, as you well know, is a market that loves to lean into regulation, and it imposes requirements inside its market and of course at the border. So in terms of sharing some sustainability insights from the EU market, you will all be aware that Europe has a subsidy model of agriculture. In more recent years, this has come under increased scrutiny as more consensus emerges that the potential for such subsidies, they're not just trade distorting, we think they are environmentally harmful. And Europe's reaction, of course, is to try and link more of these subsidies to improved animal welfare outcomes and higher environmental ambition. Extensive farm protests that you've seen in Europe over the last 12 months tell us that this approach, along with a cascade of new production regulations, has not gone down very well with the EU farmers. And they maintain they're drowning in red tape from Brussels. But this model isn't going to change. They're very much wedded to it. In the EU, sheep farmers receive a per hectare payment. It's not coupled to production, and 1/4 of this payment is tied to participation in so-called eco schemes, things like erosion prevention and windbreaks, mechanical weed control, buffer strips, with management practices without pesticide. If you convert to organic, that's seen as a good thing, semi-natural habitat creation and enhancement. Now for the farmers in the room, effectively EU farmers are being paid to do the land management that Australian farmers do just as a course of running your business. the EU farmers will actually pick from a menu of these eco schemes to get the payment. And then on top of that, the national government will add sectoral initiatives. So for example, in the case of sheep farmers in Ireland, they get paid for lameness control, mineral supplementation of ewes post-mating, meal feeding lambs post-weaning, parasite control, management of pregnant ewes, fly strike control, mineral supplementation of lambs pre-weaning, and then genotyped ram action. Again, ordinary course of business for Australian farmers as they run their sheep farming institution. So in July 2021, the EU Farm to Fork policy was published, and that was their big overarching strategy, which was going to govern how the EU farm sector would respond to the Green Deal. And if you haven't heard of Europe's Green Deal, it was their big #1 policy from President von der Leyen. It was the plan to effectively make their economy, the whole of the economy, a carbon neutral economy. As part of Farm to Fork, they have a major update to their animal welfare legislation, and they're changing rules for welfare at the time of slaughter, welfare on farm, and welfare during transport. So the most advanced is the welfare during transport. That's actually been published, and it's currently under negotiation between the Member States, the European Parliament, and the European Commission. So some of the key changes. Temperature controls. Can't move a sheep with fleece on it at higher than 28 degrees. A 9-hour transport limit if that sheep is going to the sale yard. The slaughter yard. 21-hour limit on road journeys if it's a non-slaughter road journey. And then unweaned calves must be provided milk replacements at 9-hour intervals. These are the kind of very heavily prescriptive animal welfare practices that are actually being written into EU law. This is not a guideline, a standard. This is a legislative requirement. The other two pieces of legislation are still in the pipeline. Their delay seems to be pretty much linked to some of the massive backlash from the farming community about these very strict rules. But we have seen some leaks come out. So we do see some future aspects. And in terms of other proposals and the implications, particularly for the sheep sector, likely to see compulsory video in slaughterhouses, a voluntary multi-tier animal welfare label, and that'll have things like breeding, fattening, transport and slaughter, effectively the whole supply chain. And then limitation on the frequency of breeding and potentially approval requirements for breeding establishments. I note that mulesing for fly strike, it's not commonly used in the EU, and it's actually expressly banned in certain member states. As you all well know, EU animal welfare NGOs have run several campaigns over the years to stop EU retailers buying wool from mulesed sheep. They also attempted to make it an issue during the EU FTA talks. Pain relief is already mandatory in the EU for any procedure that's likely to cause significant pain, and I think it's not unlikely that we would see an EU-wide ban on mulesing as part of this legislative change that's coming. Now, it's not coming tomorrow. There's going to be a long transition period, probably out to 2035. Because these legislative proposals are still in development, they're still going to be negotiated, and then there will be a transition phase for European farmers to adopt. But it's not clear how they will impose this at the border, but by golly, they're planning to do so. So particularly the animal welfare practices, there aren't obvious spots in the certification when you send a product to the market to capture that, but they'll certainly give it a try. So, social licence, of course, is a big issue. A negative perception of mulesing, helped by those NGO campaigns, is one example of a practice that those opposed to trade may point to as argument against Australian access. Animal welfare campaigns get significant tracking in Europe. It's a very different market. The biggest one was End the Cage Age. They had 1.4 million signatures. The Parliament had to respond. It was a very massive response from government and the public sector. So there is a risk that the new regulations in the EU are going to be trade barriers for us in the future, and we're keeping a very close eye on these. In the textile space, as the EU moves to mainstream sustainability into all the policies, it's the new eco-design regulation and the green claims directives. They're prime examples. So wool as a textile falls under these, excuse me, it'll need to meet minimum sustainability requirements, which in theory, it hasn't yet been designed what these new requirements will be, but there could be controls on the inputs you can use on farm, for instance. The Green Claims legislation aims to end greenwashing, and the whole point is that when an EU customer goes into a store and reads a label, they can believe the label. So it's a very simple and sensible policy idea, but it's a very complicated way they're getting to that outcome. Excuse me. So many people in this room will know about the product environment footprint. It's a long-term policy of the EU. It's trying to describe, I guess, a whole of life cycle product development and the environmental footprint of that product. We and the Australian sheep and wool industry, and of course the cotton industry, really dislike that framework. We think it completely undervalues natural fibres, and the Australian government and industry, we've been working together for many years to try and raise our concerns with the EU on that. The Make the Label Count campaign that's happening, funded by AWE and International Wool Textile Organisation, has been really effective in market. It was fantastic to see, and we want to see that continue. So, did the recent EU Parliament change anything? No, not really. And you would have seen, no doubt, some commentary about going more to the right. Didn't really happen, and excuse me, the centre-left and the centre-right are probably going to hold the power. So what does that mean? It means that the European Green Deal is probably going to slow down, but it's not going in the bin. Neither is the farm-to-fork strategy. It's more likely that the agriculture sector will get more of a say in policy development to try and meet things a bit more halfway, but this is the direction of travel for the EU. During the recent farm protests, a common cry from EU farmers was they don't operate in a level playing field, which is they're saying we have to meet all these rules. We can't possibly compete with imports that are of lower standard. And everything outside the EU is of a lower standard, according to the EU farmers. So we have high standards, we all know that. But the EU's view of these is it's often overly prescriptive and trade restrictive. And so we've already seen moves in this in relation to pesticide. So some key takeaways for you. Whether you're exporting wool or lamb to the EU market, the sustainability credentials of your product are important now and will become increasingly important. Not just to keep up with your competitors in the market, but potentially even just to access the market. Sustainability claims are under further scrutiny, so they're going to be subject to audits. We'll need to make and have comprehensive evidence of our claims. And although the EU is moving faster than the markets, as you know, they're a regulation setter, other markets will pick up some of these as well. So diverting to an alternate market may not always save you. Of course, Australian farmers are better placed than many others to seize these opportunities and deliver on our sustainability credentials. We need to be able to tell our story, deliver our evidence, our credentials, and continue to push for a more holistic view of sustainability and that no one size fits all that model. And if we do that, we will get our market access right in years to come. And the Sheep Sustainability Framework is a key tool for us to do that. So I certainly commend it. I commend the industry for it. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm very happy to answer questions.